I want to start by reading a couple of verses from Paul's second epistle to the church in Corinth and chapter 6. I'm going to read the first two verses. We appeal to you not to receive the grace of God in vain. For he says, in a favourable time I listened to you, and in a day of salvation I have helped you. Behold, now is the favourable time. Now is the day of salvation. A couple of years ago, I travelled up to London to go to a concert. Having lived in London for about 5 years, I absolutely love to visit the city. I enjoy walking its streets and visiting its galleries and just sucking up the cosmopolitan atmosphere. So I made a day trip of it, knowing that the concert, which I'd really been looking forward to, didn't start until 7:30. I arrived in London early in the morning and played the tourist all day. And in the evening, I got some food at a favourite place of mine and ambled to the concert venue, only to discover, as I arrived at about 7:20, that the concert had started at 7 o'clock. I'd simply assumed that it started at 7:30 without actually looking at my ticket. And so I was forced to sit out the first half of the concert, as I was only allowed into the concert venue during the interval. I had a ticket to listen to the music. The music was playing. I really wanted to listen to the music, but I wasn't there. I was missing out. Now, in this short passage, the writer, the Apostle Paul, is telling the church in Corinth that, in effect, the concert has begun, but they haven't taken their seats yet. The music is playing. They've got tickets, but they just haven't turned up. He says, behold, now is the favourable time. Now is the day of salvation. Now, these words are quoted from Isaiah chapter 49, and they imagine God speaking from a future. He's speaking from a promised future, a future when God's salvation will have finally arrived. And if you were to read Isaiah 49, you would see that salvation is described in really amazing terms. It's all about security and abundance and peacefulness and fruitfulness. So what are those words doing here in these verses that we've just read? Well, they form part of an appeal. Paul is pleading with his readers. We appeal to you not to receive the grace of God in vain, he says. This is heartfelt stuff. There are big things at stake here, and clearly the people Paul is writing to are getting it really seriously wrong. And so he urges them, he exhorts them, he pleads with them to change. But this is also more than a bit confusing. Why is Paul suggesting that Christians can receive God's grace in vain? And why is he writing to a church, urging them to take advantage of the present opportunity for salvation? I think these questions can cause a lot of difficulty if we read these verses in a very narrow sense as referring to conversion. Clearly, Paul isn't questioning whether these people really do belong to Christ or not. He's talking about something completely different here. What he's saying is that the long-promised day of salvation, the age of God's blessing and of flourishing of life, has begun. It began when Jesus rose from the dead and poured out the Holy Spirit on the church. Now is the age of life. Now is the time of renewal. To be fair, I guess this might sound a little bit ironic given what we've all had to go through for the past 16 months. Daily, we've heard reports of the deaths of thousands of people from this dreadful virus. So how can this really be the age of life, flourishing and renewal? Well, one way to think about this is to remember that during the dawn, there is still darkness. And when a war has ended, the hardships created by that war continue for a time. But be in no doubt, Jesus is risen from the dead. The Son of Righteousness has risen, and the victory has been won. And so the threat that the apostle is trying to get these Christians to see is that it's possible to belong to Christ and yet to be so preoccupied with other stuff that we miss out on what Christ gives to us right here and right now. It's possible to live in the daylight, but to not open the curtains. It's possible to have emerged victorious from the war, and yet to continue in the hostility and fear that the war provoked. What does all this look like? Well, in the case of this church, it looked pretty unpleasant. There was a lack of forgiveness. There was an addiction to factionalism instead of unity. There was exclusion instead of generosity, hospitality, and love. And these problems, the lack of forgiveness, factionalism, exclusion, they don't belong only to the ancient world. We see plenty of this behavior today, and we might also recognize it in our own ways of relating to others. But at this point, I want to ask you to just be aware of your reactions to this. If you're thinking of others or even an entire tradition within the church that seems to you to relate to the world in this way, just be aware that you could be responding in a way that puts you on the moral high ground, looking down on the failures of others. Be aware of the danger of being unforgiving and of dividing the church into factions in doing this. But perhaps, on the other hand, you're actually thinking of yourself, and in doing so are being equally unforgiving and dismissive. I want to caution us really against these very natural feelings and responses. You see, in responding in this way, we are unwittingly perpetuating the problem. And through our responses, unforgiveness and division lives on. It would be far better, I think, if we try to understand something of the mechanism that produces these responses. And it seems to me that all of them are driven by anxiety. But what is it we're afraid of when we're quick to think of ourselves as better than others? To answer this question, I think we need to look at the effects of this behavior. And these are many. But they will include a narrow focus within church life and within the lives of other communities, a suspicious view of outsiders, a negative disposition when we're quick to identify the failings of others, why others need to be treated with suspicion, kept at arm's length. Now, fundamentally, all of these effects have one great impact on our lives. They keep us isolated from others. They prevent us from experiencing intimacy. And this, therefore, I suggest, is the object of our fear. This is what we're afraid of, intimacy. We can put this in another way and say that if a fear of intimacy is what drives a lack of forgiveness and factionalism, then the payoff of this negative behavior within the church is that it allows us to not be close. Now, I guess this might sound more than a little strange. How can something so bad be called a payoff? Well, because by not being intimate with others, we are actually kept safe from the threat of being rejected by them, from the threat of being exposed by them, from the threat of being worse than them, from all sorts of dangers that belong to open and intimate relationships. The word for intimacy in the Bible is love. And so what we are really afraid of is love itself. We're afraid of the very thing that underpins the day of salvation. This new era that has dawned with the resurrection of Jesus. We're in the light, but Fear keeps our eyes closed. We've got tickets to the concert, but we haven't taken our seats yet. And so we're invited to listen to Paul's encouragement, to open our eyes and see the benefit of the grace of God that we have received, experience God's salvation in all its fullness. So don't lose out on the dawn of this day of salvation by allowing fear to shut your eyes. Don't squander the grace of God. Have courage and fully experience his salvation by opening your heart to others, accepting them with their faults, and while you're at it, accepting yourself also.